Good afternoon and most welcome to Heidegger 1338. Today I will take a little summary of the marvelous book by Richard E. Nisbett, The Geography of Thought, and see how it relates to the whole series we've been making, and also especially maybe the last 20 to 30 lectures. And there is a specific thing to consider here, and this is coming from neurology. Special thanks to Jan Eiskens to hinting to this. 1 second of pause and priming, which in a way equals the Oriental way of having a short ritual ceremony. Could also see them from a Western perspective as unnecessary corrections, but also what we already use in the Western world. Order, neatness, I would say. And then we go to consideration, the thinking process. In neurology, bodily and, so to speak, mentally thinking is not disjunct. As we learned earlier, the T1 cells are equal to the N cells of the neuron. So there is a connection between muscular doings thinking and neuronal doings thinking. They are keenly connected, and this one pause, 1 second pause or longer, will stimulate the development of the N1 neurons and activate them. Their thinking is deeper, wider, and more expansive. And the muscular system is wider, broader, larger, and also more directed. There is a connection here. And my thesis is that in the East there is a well-established system within the society to sort of stall the bad guys, which is an exaggeration of course, but when we mention N2 and T2, the fast reactive, shallow thinking, the determining distinction in a bad way or not positive way, superficial way of taking the word, grasping. And this grasping is literally, you do grasp with your hands. Remember Lakoff Johnson. There will be a tension in the hand. And I think this is one of the first time it happened here in UB. I found this whiteboard pen, and as you can see, barely it has run out of ink. But this time it is still sharp. Nobody has pressed it. So this has been around for maybe a couple of weeks, and it's been used until it's finished in a good, sensible way. Very unusual. Usually the tips are pressed beyond belief, and they are impossible to form to letters. So as you can see, it still carries ink. This is a little bit what I'm pointing to. Do take a pause before, it doesn't have to be very long, and then let into consideration or thinking, which amounts to the same thing, and then end with a pause. Very important. There is a start to this process, but there is also a finish. The left hemisphere wants to have everything continuous. it is the idea of linearity. In linearity, there are no pauses. Everything is same, homogeneous, and so forth. You know the drill. That is linearity. So there is an equivalence to linearity in the neuromuscular system. Do keep this in mind as I do the summary of Richard Nisbett. I will also, within some time, do a more careful look into one of his chapters. And hopefully in the future I will not have to do this electrical cord. My hope is to have a wireless, so it'll be easier to move about. I will now start with Geography of Thought, a short summary by Richard Nisbett. Chapter 1, the syllogism and the Tao. Nisbett argues that the Greeks had a highly unusual and unusually developed sense of personal agency. This sense of individualism coincided with an equally developed curiosity. This in turn led them to cultivate learning as an important social and leisure activity. This contrasts sharply with a Chinese sense of collective agency, through which individuals nourished their sense of self through social relations, contributing to group goals and carrying out prescribed roles. This emphasis on belonging and contributing diminished confrontation, debate, and curiosity. These two social tendencies were reflected in the two civilizations' main philosophies. The Greeks developed highly linear methods of understanding objects in isolation. This led to explanations of phenomena in terms of properties. such as a stone possessing gravity and a piece of wood possessing levity. A second characteristic of Greek thought is the emphasis on stasis. Things do not change because things have properties. And properties cannot vary. Chinese philosophy, on the other hand, emphasized flux, holism, complexity, and resonance. All things were to be understood in terms of their relationship to and embeddedness in their environments. While the Greeks understood discrete objects in isolation, the Chinese understood objects as part and as part of and inseparable from a larger environment. These two views led to two philosophical languages. The Greek that emphasized linearity, objectification, and elimination through contradiction. And the Chinese that emphasized circularity, holism, and an acceptance of contradiction. This because contradiction was seen only as a distinction between now and a future state. Chapter 2. The social origins of mind. The author proposes a theory in the second chapter that socio-economic and cultural factors affect cognitive habits. Specifically, the Greek mind, and hence the Western European mind, developed tendencies toward personal freedom, individuality, and objective thought. Because of an ecology that gave rise to economic and social structures such as shipping, trading, and hunting that enhanced individualism. In turn, these structures enhanced attentional tendencies to notice and describe objects in isolation. Which led to an epistemology and a metaphysic that explained objects and their properties in isolation. In contrast, the Chinese ecology led to an agricultural society that emphasized interdependent networks of social relations. This led to attentional tendencies that focused on interconnectedness and relationships among objects. Which naturally gave rise to a holistic philosophy that emphasized change and flux. if the theory is correct, it ought to be testable through experiments that measure field dependence, a measurable tendency to see things as being isolated or integrated. Specifically, differences between Western European and East Asian people ought to manifest themselves in perceptions about objects and environments, objects and substances, the controllability of the environment, stability and change, categories and relationships, logical rules, and comfort with contradiction. Chapter 3, living together versus going it alone. Nisbett argues that the Eastern concept of self is quite different from the corresponding Western concept. Asian sense of feeling good often comes from participation in a group, as can be seen by the fact that in Chinese there is no word for individualism. The closest one can come is the word selfishness. Not only are Asians less aware of the individual, they also see themselves as being more malleable, describing themselves in different ways according to the occasion. Indeed, individuals in Eastern culture take pleasure in being involved in a harmonious network of supportive social relationships. And in playing one's part in achieving collective ends. Numerous studies prove that traits typical of independent and interdependent people align themselves with Western and Eastern styles of being. Westerners prefer choices that allow autonomy. While Asians typically prefer those that encourage group preference or guidance from an authority figure. This is true from children to corporate workers, to parents. These preferences are paralleled by Western preferences for binding contracts and legalistic resolution to conflicts, presumably because the individual is responsible for knowing and obeying the law. And for Eastern preference for negotiation and consideration of circumstance. Studies also indicate that Western and Eastern language differs on these matters as well. Westerners have a highly developed rhetoric of argumentation. While Asians rarely engage in this kind of dialogue. This is true of business, science, education, and law. Consequently, Asians often try to negotiate agreeable solutions in business or law where Westerners might see conflict resolved only in victory. This is equally true in science and education, where Asians might find technological solutions but will not argue for the correctness of their theories in the same way that Western scientists or education commonly do. Chapter 4. Eyes in the back of your head, or keep your eye on the ball. Nisbett hypothesizes that if social existence dictates the way that people see the world, then modern East Asian mentalities ought to mirror those of ancient Asia, and modern Western mentalities ought to parallel those of ancient Greece. This should be true, he says, not only of mental outlooks, but of actual perceptual tendencies. Many tests bear this hypothesis out. For example, Americans consistently identify objects by their shape, while Asians identify the substance of which something is made and see two objects as being alike if they share the same substance. Even though they may have different shapes or different functions. These perceptual tendencies spill over to the workplace, where Americans see companies as composed of discrete parts and workers as having distinct jobs. Whereas Asians, work is seen as a holistic place in which networks of people work together to reach an end. This is true more generally as well. Tests demonstrate that even as children, Americans are more object and fact-oriented than Asians. Which allows Asians to be far more aware of environment and social context. As adults, Asians describe things contextually. While Americans describe objects as environment independent. Consequently, Asians are better at seeing relationships between events. One result of these perceptual differences is that Americans perceive themselves as being more in control of their environments and their destinies. Not only do they see themselves as more in control, but Americans express a decided need to be in control. Whereas Asians express comfort with the fact that many things are beyond their control. This tacit understanding of the individual's role in controlling his future may explain why Americans consistently saw trends as likely to continue, and Asians saw them as signs that they would likely reverse. Chapter 5, The Bad Seed, or The Other Boys Made Him Do It. In this chapter, Nisbett theorizes that Asians emphasize context more in their causal explanations than do Americans. Consequently, Americans use theories about individual personalities to explain actions and outcomes. Whereas Asians tend to offer explanations that emphasize environment. This is equally true in simple perceptual tests that indicate that Westerners ascribe more to properties of objects than do Asians, who see environments as influencing objects. Westerners attend primarily to the focal object or person, and Asians attend more broadly to the field. Westerners tend to assume that events are caused by the objects, and Asians are inclined to assign greater importance to the context. One interesting facet of these tendencies is that Americans tend to isolate objects or people in causal chains. while Asians emphasize the complex nature of multiple events in any given situation. This makes American explanations of historical events more simplistic and Asian explanations more complex. It's getting more and more interesting. Chapter 6 is the world made up of nouns or verbs. This chapter explores the relationships between language and thought. Demonstrating that Asian and Western languages reflect the perspective differences of their respective speakers. Westerners, for example, use categories to classify objects more readily and more frequently than Asians. Who prefer to describe objects in terms of relationships. Consequently, Westerners also apply rules to categorization more easily. This difference starts out in childhood, where studies prove that Western children learn nouns faster than verbs. And Asian children learn verbs faster than Western children. This may in turn be partly attributable to the languages themselves, given that East Asian languages are highly contextual. With meaning necessarily being extracted from context, whereas English words are intentionally decontextualized. For example, English sentences focus largely on objects, with the subject often taking primary place, whereas Asian sentences mostly begin with context and topic. This could mean that differences in linguistic structure between languages are reflected in people's habitual thinking processes. Tests about how people group objects based on relationships or characteristics bear this out, suggesting that thought patterns are affected by both culture and language. Excuse me. Chapter 7, Ce n'est pas logique, or You've got the point there. And this is enough for a whole library of books. And this is different take on logic. Eastern and Western views of logic have diverged greatly. With the Asian tradition making only slight inroads in logical theory. Graham Priest. And never separating logic from context. Consequently, Asians use experience more and logical principles less in judging propositions. This leads to the observation that Asians often seek conflict resolution through some middle ground, while Americans commonly choose one side of an argument. This leads us to believe that Americans are generally uncomfortable with contradiction, while Asians are not. A conclusion confirmed by numerous tests. One such test, for example, shows that Asians are likely to report contradictory emotions when describing a face, while Americans are likely to choose between emotions such as happy or sad. I will make a little summary here. And this is going to be my retake. I will depart from the book here and I will take to chapter 8 separately. The first I need to mention is the Tao, the first chapter. Do remember the yin-yang symbol. I think that is possibly one of the best pointers to a different way of thinking. It is not square. There are two areas going into each other. And if it not were enough with that, there are even two dots of the contradictory color turning up in the other area. We mentioned before that the Western take of reality itself is highly different. I like the expression eyes in the neck. When I look into the camera here, everything that is behind me seems to disappear into an abyss of either past or not being present. And remember what was mentioned about logic, and I think this is highly important, that a contradiction is a change in time. Something changes and thereby becomes a contradiction if you only see them from one standpoint. Compare that to the Eastern view, where they take in the surroundings, but also expanding the now. It took me a long time when I was in Japan to understand the word ima. It could mean just an instance, but it could mean the world today or a whole week. Most usually, in contrast to what I perceived now to be, it extended in a social communication way, like a tea break or lunch, dinner. Working day was an ima. So the difference in modus and where you put your foot down, as I usually do as a Westerner, I fixate and I say, this is the now from where I'm looking, and also this is the here. This is what makes for me the homogeneous sameness of linearity. This is making every now to be a point on the line. And from this point you can extract, which was later done in history by Descartes, to construct an origo in the coordinate system, and later to a whole physical theory of Newton, which supposes my bodily putting the foot down, tensing my knees, and discarding the past and the future. So very, very nicely put. And another thing, in Japanese, as I remember, there was sometimes aggravating way of talking. They pronounce each syllable almost with the same intonation or stress, which for me as a speaker of a Western language feels very odd. I want to get to the point. Where is the tram? Tram is more important. The same in Japanese. Each syllable would have the same stress, and even to the point that what I think is more important, the becoming of the tram is put last. So it's, you have to wait for it. Japanese being a language that ends in verbs, not only end the sentence with verbs, but something that is very important for us in this standfast position, tensed, neglective, is the contradiction. And where might the contradiction, the not or the no, come in Japanese? And to my horror, and to many learners of Japanese, it comes at the very end. No Western language, as I know, has that quality. To me, it was usually explained in the manner, well, it's very comfortable for a Japanese person if he wants to propose something or state something, that he can look at the other person or persons and then change his mind at the end. I think, yes, of course, but I think, as Nisbett is pointing to, there is a bit more to it. It is the extended now. Wait for it. Make a break, because we rush for the contradiction. And it could be that we destroy the power of the contradiction by doing so. Important feature of language, which I'm pretty sure animals do not possess. They don't understand a contradiction. I might be wrong, but I seriously doubt that they understand contradiction. And by grasping too quickly for the not, we lose its power. We lose the finesse of it. Because, so aptly put by Nisbett, contradiction is essentially a difference in a present state in contradistinction to a future state or a past state. Aristotle did not understand that, and it took me a while to get some hint of it at least. And it was also mentioned here, everything is taken into context. A proposition is put into its proper context, its living environment. And what is that? Well, it's nothing less than taking care of both, maybe you could, both form and content. We tend to disregard the form, the modus, and just look at the content. But they take in both simultaneously. And I would say, this is my point of view, thereby the logic also sharpens up. I think that view is shared by Graham Priest. By ignoring the form, you also lose the content, the so-called force of logic. You need to be seen in what discourse it's put in, at which moment. Can you see here how me tensing up, being close to the environment, I'm being that both spiritually and mentally and bodily. I will do the closing off of some part of reality to grasp it. And this, I would say, how I experienced logic when I studied it. it was a bit of grasping too hard to just the content. And all of a sudden, logic became nullified, to use Rodolphe Gachet expression. It was dissolved into its contradictions and became evaporated, dissolved. This is, of course, as we remember, the landscape problem. Not seeing in what sort of canvas, what sort of shape, the Cartesian coordinates, if you like, or why not how Stephen Hawking and Max Tegmark perceive space as nothing. And that nothingness also takes away the importance of what here is relation, materiality, direction, disconsidering, one can use here, shutting a part of the world off and trying to see with one left hemisphere eye, having categories object in isolation, and then after the isolation process trying to put them together. Kalle, maybe a colleague, maybe you have some. Oh yeah, of course, thanks.
Yes, you are right that for Westerners it's so easy to forget the form, and we can also think about another F, not only form but frame, as you have many times emphasized that form and frame, we often forget them or minimize them. I think perhaps the phrase of the day could be, where is the point? That is, the Westerners have tendency to say there is the point in sense metaphorical and literal sense. That is, we think in points or in punctuality like that, points, dots, while Easterners think more in a circular way.
Taking in everything, surrounding.
Yes, and speaking of that, Makiltrist form the matter with things. This is part 2, and here you have chapter 23 is entitled flower movement. That emphasizes this flower movement is the Easterners have feeling for flower movement. So this is the and I was thinking the last thing, Schrödinger's cat is also to return to it. So we have a contradiction. We could think about that as a normal contradiction. The cat is both dead and or the cat is dead or alive. Okay, since we Westerners don't like contradictions, we put the other part in the contradiction to another planet. Which is a ridiculous way of...
This is actually exactly that point of Bourdieu.
Yeah, is that? Yes, indeed.
And it's inevitable since you start isolating. And another hint I can give is this was not a contrast between Westerners, but it was within Western cultures. And it's a memory that comes to my mind now. We were at a summer vacation, and I was together with an Englishman, and somebody fell, an elderly man, I think he fell and started bleeding. Somebody wanted to help him and looked if anybody could offer a towel to sort of fix his wound. And my English friend offered his towel. But the person taking the towel didn't ask for permission, didn't say please, not in Swedish, not English, and had a rather stressed condition over. That is ignoring the form, the frame. And if you ever go to an Asian country, that would be even more so. I can imagine if a Korean called 911 or Japanese even if the house is burning, they will start the sentence, "Excuse me, could you please help me? It is a little bit of an emergency." I never managed to cope with that, I have to be honest. Too often when I was in Japan, I did just as my colleague Kalle pointed out here, where is the point, or what is the point? And of course, to ask that question in a Japanese context will never or ever lead to an answer. What is the point? Yes, very good, Kalle. We are pointillistic, to use an art term. I think that is very good. We only see the dots, but the Easterners seem to be seeing everything, and then they can go down to the dot, and then they will also have an understanding the content. And Graham Priest is stating he is not dissolving or criticizing logic, he is saving it. And in that mentioning, he's absolutely true. Who could say anything else? Logical explosion is a disaster, and he managed to avoid it. And how could logicians at this university, and I'm afraid many others, especially in my own country, Sweden here, still defend the law of the excluded middle and pay the price of explosion, which makes all logical senses useless in any practical? I think that is, this is when you took it to the absurd conclusion, you can see the problems. This seemed to be a calmer position, and I calm down when I take in the surroundings. When I do not try to grasp as quick and as hard, I understand better. But it's a sharpness to this type of understanding, because this is what builds contradictions. And of course, this is also logocentrism. Or the metaphysics of now. So you see the many interesting things coming together, and I'll be more than happy to come back to Nisbett pretty soon. I say thank you very much and have a very pleasant afternoon.
Thank you.